It's August 30th, 2023, a little after 2 o'clock. Welcome everyone out. I'd like to have a motion if I could to approve the minutes of October the 15th, 2022. Thank you. Any discussions of that? Seeing none, all in favor of approving the minutes, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, if any? Stand approved. We're going to go ahead and receive the presentation from contracted research entity. Nicole Martin Rogers, research scientist, and Wilder's research. Be first. The time is yours.
You're good to go, Nicole. Can you hear us okay?
Yeah, I can hear you all. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Good afternoon. It's nice to see everybody again. Thanks for having us. I'm Nicole Martin Rogers. I'm a research scientist at Wilder. And Jesse, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure thing. Hi, everyone. It's so nice to be here with you today. My name is Jesse Austin, and I'm a research associate at Wilder Research.
So we're happy to be here today to talk to you about the research that we've been working on, which many of you all have been a part of. I'm going to share my screen here so we can get started. Right. So just quickly, by way of introduction, I know many of you got this when we first started working with you, but as a reminder, we work for Wilder Research, which is a nonprofit organization that's based in St. Paul. We do applied research and program evaluation on a wide range of topics, and we're really community-based and policy-oriented researchers versus academic research. You know, we're really trying to apply this to the real problem, in this case, of the missing and murdered Indigenous relatives in justice. And we do have quite a bit of experience working on this topic with the Minnesota MMIW task force and the new MMIR office in Minnesota. And we'd really like to thank you for the opportunity to do this important research with the Utah MMIR task force. So with that, we'll jump right in. And just to let you know, we're going to kind of go over a lot of the key findings from the report today, and then we'll have some time at the end, both to answer any questions you have, you know, clarifying questions about the report, as well as to have some discussion about the recommendations. So definitely feel free to, you know, make some notes as we're going along if you have any questions or thoughts for us about ways that we can improve the report. That's really the purpose of today's discussion. And then we'll have time at the end for public comment as well, in case any of the experts that we interviewed or any folks, you know, with lived experience would like to speak on this as well. And this is a draft report that we're presenting you today, so we do have plenty of time to take feedback and make improvements to the report with your feedback in mind. So we'll welcome that later on in the discussion. And thanks for your attention during this presentation. We're going to try to get through a lot of content pretty quickly here, so we do have time to talk. So as you all know, the Utah legislature created the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Task Force, which was renamed in 2023 to the MMIR Task Force. R stands for relatives. In 2022, you all contracted with Wilder Research, that's us. And we're doing this research project that has the following goals. And really, again, today, we are try to focus on the recommendations that we've drafted some for your consideration, and we'll try to tighten those up so that the final product has these recommendations for improvements to the system to address the MMIR injustice in Utah. And I also wanted to note that in addition to the projects that we're contracted to do in Minnesota and Utah, we've also been invited to participate in a convening that happened in the end of June in New Mexico with several states that are all working on MMIR issues. And at that convening, we had the opportunity to share some of the things that we've learned in Utah and Minnesota, and also to learn some things from other states that's kind of also worked in here in terms of some good ideas they had that we thought, oh, maybe Utah and Minnesota should consider these. So you'll see some of that reflected in the recommendations. And I'm going to pass it over to Jesse to talk about the process that we use to do the study.
Thank you, Nicole. So we began our research process by conducting a thorough review of the literature on relevant state and federal policy, as well as best and emerging practices. And then we heard from folks on the ground through several different means. So first, we conducted interviews with 28 different key informants with a wide range of expertise in things like law enforcement, medical legal, death investigation, law practice, and then people like advocates, service providers, researchers, and others. And we also held a listening session in Bluff, Utah, in partnership with Restoring Ancestral Winds, with family members, community members, and service providers from the community and the immediate surrounding area. And so once we collected all this information, we then conducted qualitative analysis to identify key issues, strengths, and gaps existing in Utah. And all of that information kind of fell into these 9 major themes. So reporting and investigation of missing person cases, communication and alert systems, review and investigation of unresolved or cold cases, death investigation, jurisdiction issues and government to government collaboration, data issues, victim and family services, prevention, and media reporting. So lots of different topics we're going to cover today and in the report as well. So for each of those topics, we're going to provide, or we did provide in the report, and we'll cover the highlights today of the state and federal policy landscape, best and emerging practices, current issues in Utah, and then some draft recommendations for your review and feedback. And so the full report was sent out to task force members and experts last week. And so we've already heard back from some folks, which has been really helpful. And we look forward to incorporating your and their feedback in the coming months. We did want to highlight a couple of important limitations to bear in mind when taking in all of our findings and recommendations. So we did have fairly limited tribal participation. We did attempt to reach out to tribal leadership in Utah through several different means, but we did encounter difficulties in reaching leaders. And so the input of tribes is not fully reflected in these key findings and recommendations. And so one of our first and foremost and most important recommendations is encouraging the state of Utah to follow up with tribes through formal consultation processes to ensure that these recommendations align with tribes' needs and expectations and priorities. And then secondly, the primary focus of our study is on the system response after someone has gone missing or already been the victim of violence. And we want to emphasize how important it is to pursue future research that investigates and addresses the underlying factors that may contribute to Indigenous folks being at higher risk of victimization and preventing that in the first place.
Thanks, Jesse. So we're going to jump right in and talk about these key findings. Again, today we're just going with some of the highest level themes. You'll have to dive into the report where you would find a lot more nuance and detail about these, maybe some other ideas that we aren't able to cover here that were less commonly mentioned. So we do encourage you to read the entire report. The findings here, again, are sort of a synthesis of all these data sources. So we are triangulating information from the literature review, the policy review, the key informants, the listening sessions, and public comments. And some of these recommendations came directly from people who we interviewed, and other things we're kind of like, again, synthesizing or learning from other places that we've seen. So the point of today's discussion and some of the additional sessions that we have planned over the next few weeks, which we'll talk about at the end, this is really intended for task force members and other key stakeholders and experts to provide feedback so that we can refine the recommendations, make sure it meets your needs, and make sure we're focusing on what you perceive as the most pressing issues in Utah. So please know that some of these recommendations will change based on the feedback that we hear today and in the coming weeks. None of this is a done deal, and we do plan to make changes based on feedback. And we really want the final report and recommendations, which we'll present back to you in November, to be things that all the task force members really feel like you understand and you can stand behind, So, right, please speak up if we're missing something, if there's something you don't understand, something that doesn't seem right to you. We will have plenty of time after this presentation to discuss things today and get your feedback at a later date if we need to make any changes. So just know that we are really open to that and want you to feel like you've dove in enough at this point that when we get to November, you're not like, wait, what was that? What is this thing? And feel surprised about anything. So not, today and the sessions coming up are your chance to do that. So I'm just going to start right in on the first big topic area, which is missing person reporting and investigation, like when there's an emergent missing person case. And we learned really through our research that there is a lot of information and guidance out there about missing in person investigations and how to do them properly. So all law enforcement agencies should have standard policies and procedures that are based on up-to-date best practice guidance that includes all the newest information about social media and geofencing on cell phone towers and all the newest technology that we know is important in a emergent missing person investigation. The agency should also ensure that their policies are followed really consistently, regardless of who the victim is, who the family member who's doing the reporting, or who the officer is taking the report. So some of the best practice guidance that we learned about includes that, law enforcement should really assume that someone who's being reported as missing needs assistance until they find evidence that indicates otherwise. There's a common public misconception that there's like a 24-hour or 72-hour waiting period after someone goes missing before law enforcement will respond. But with regard to best practice and also hopefully with regard to agencies' policies, law enforcement agencies really should accept missing person reports and conduct the investigation without any delay. This can be a particular issue, either for the family or law enforcement might tell family, let's wait and see if a person who's being reported as missing has a history of going missing. This might include certain groups like children who've previously run away from out-of-home placements, people who are being trafficked, people who are addicted to drugs, or people who are experiencing homelessness, folks that tend to be a little bit more transient. Law enforcement should follow still a consistent practice with those folks and investigate if they're being reported as missing, but that's not always necessarily what happens or what families experience. And really, there are few federal or state laws that are related to reporting missing adults. Missing children are different because there's some crime that's committed if a child is removed or taken away from their parents without permission. But adults can be missing voluntarily. There's not necessarily a crime just because a relative can't locate their loved one. That person might have chosen to leave, right? So there's not a lot of laws related to missing adults, but in the state of Utah, there is a law that requires law enforcement agencies to report missing adults to NCIC, which is the National Crime Information Center, but there's really no specific time requirement. So these are some places where, in terms of statute, that things could be tightened up in Utah in case any of the policymakers are interested in following up on some of this stuff. Like this is an area, having a adult missing person law, such as Brandon's law in Minnesota or other examples, that could be a place to consider for future work. And we know from Utah's experts, as well as experts in other states, that law enforcement doesn't consistently follow existing policies. And again, that's not just Utah, that's other states as well. But that could be due to a lot of different reasons. It could be due to bias. It could be due to lack of training about what the law is or how to do a good missing person investigation. It could be due to challenges in capacity in the agency. They just don't have staff capacity to do it. And there could be other reasons too. So, there's a lot of different reasons why an existing policy might not be followed consistently. So we know from listening to community members who are directly impacted by this issue and advocates that people who go missing and who lack close relationships with family or friends may be particularly likely to fall through the cracks because there's no one to calling and following up with law enforcement about the status of the relative's case, encourage more efforts to be taken in the investigation and things like that. And sometimes family members might actually be reluctant to call law enforcement to even report their loved one is missing. Either they might not believe that their case might be taken seriously based on their own prior experience or collective community prior experiences. They might fear consequences if they contact law enforcement, such as getting arrested for outstanding warrants, or getting child protection cases opened or escalated, or getting child protection involved. And so in some cases, they might be reluctant to get law enforcement involved, even if they can't locate their loved one because of some of those concerns. In Indian country and Utah, there's also challenges of getting a timely law enforcement response and even determining which law enforcement agency has jurisdiction. So once a missing person investigation is underway, a lot of rural areas lack access to specialized investigative resources and capacity and technology and expertise, again, needed to do kind of this rigorous best practice type of missing person investigation. Tribal community response plans are a tool that was initially developed with the Department of Justice. The MMIP coordinators were supposed to be helping tribes to complete these plans, but then those positions were eliminated. So it really never took hold. But this tool is something that we'd encourage you to become familiar with and potentially assess the interest and willingness of the tribes in Utah to participate. It can be it's a tool that's a way for a tribe to coordinate with local and state agencies to ensure that they have a plan ahead of time. So in case God forbid they do receive a missing person report, all agencies already know ahead of time, and they've already agreed how they're going to work together and who's supposed to do what to ensure a swift and effective missing person response. So this is something that we'd encourage you to explore further. So getting to the recommendations just for this particular section of the report, if there's capacity within the state of Utah, again, or federal agencies to support tribes with these tribal community response plans, these should be tribally led, but need to have involvement of other agencies. And so would be a great place to start if there's tribes that are interested. Again, the post board and state and local law enforcement agencies should review and update policies and procedures as needed. Possibly might want to consider some legislation about missing adults, like Brandon's Law in Minnesota, and how missing person reports should be handled, and if there's a time frame within which they should be entered into NCIC and other things like that. And probably most importantly, find ways to build more trust between law enforcement and communities. So if someone does go missing, their relatives will understand what the process is supposed to be and feel safe and comfortable and confident that someone is going to respond and actually help them if they contact law enforcement for help with a missing relative. So I'm going to turn it over to Jesse to talk about our next topic.
So next we're going to move on to communication and alert systems. So Utah has several different existing systems, which includes Amber Alerts for missing abducted children, Silver Alerts for endangered elderly adults or those with dementia and similar conditions, and then Endangered Missing Advisories, which are for missing endangered persons of any age who don't necessarily meet the criteria for Amber Alerts or Silver Alerts. These alert systems work in different ways. So while Amber Alerts activate electronic roadway signs, cell phones, and emails, the EMAs, those endangered missing advisories, are more of a voluntary communication network that are just used by law enforcement to distribute information about missing persons to the media. And so for EMAs, which are generally used for missing adults, for example, no roadway signs, cell phones, or emails are activated, largely due to concerns about overuse of the system impacting effectiveness. So from our interviews with experts and from listening to folks with lived experience at the listening sessions, we heard that tribes face some barriers to participating and utilizing Utah's Amber Alert system. So key informants reported that except for the Navajo Nation, tribes have to utilize either State Highway Patrol or the local county sheriff's office that shares geography with them to activate Amber Alerts. So the BIA and FBI as federal agencies are unable to issue Amber Alerts through Utah systems. And we heard from key informants some concerns that, at least in some cases, the working relationships between tribes and local county or state law enforcement may not be sufficient or strong enough to support tribes' participation in the Amber Alert system. And experts and also family members and community members also commented on how lack of cell phone infrastructure in some parts of Utah impacts the Amber Alert system effectiveness. So in some more remote parts of Utah where there isn't cell phone coverage or insufficient or spotty cell phone coverage, Amber Alerts may not go off at all. People may not receive them. And so that could impact law enforcement success in investigating and locating missing children, even when the alerts are disseminated. And so in terms of recommendations for communication and alert systems, we would encourage Utah to assess and identify all the barriers to full utilization of these communication systems to make sure that they're comprehensive, accessible, and unbiased, in particular related to gaps in infrastructure that inhibit effectiveness, and potentially, if of tribal interest, building relationships and establishing memorandums of understanding so that there are set processes in place if a child does go missing on tribal lands, so that folks are able to work together and disseminate alerts as appropriate. And then additionally, considering expanding the EMA system to include cell phones or emails or a roadway sign communication network to more broadly disseminate information about missing adults.
Thanks, Jesse. The next topic that we're going to talk about is unresolved cases. So once a missing person case is unsolved for a period of time, it might be considered a cold case or unsolved or long-term. Those are all sort of terms that are used. In Utah, there's a cold case review board that the experts that we interviewed found to be a valuable resource. And there may be some additional opportunities for more partnerships or more use of that type of approach to better address the MMIR injustice in Utah. One key issue that we've heard about is that after cases remain unsolved for a period of time, families begin to feel as if they're not being prioritized by law enforcement. So a best practice for law enforcement is to maintain regular communication with family members, even in long-term cases, and also to try to find a way for them to balance focus on long-term cases, even when they have new missing person cases and other law enforcement issues in business that are constantly pressing on them. It's hard, especially again in under-resourced and rural agencies that don't have a dedicated resource to cold cases. So, in rural agencies, it's both limited resources. Sometimes it might be staff capacity, just like they don't have enough officers that anyone would have time to spend on a cold case. They also have lack of expertise or specialization in how to properly do a cold case investigation. And so these are all are barriers to investigating and solving these long-term cases. Another issue is not having adequate evidence from the original scene and preliminary investigation that can hugely limit the ability to solve long-term cases. Law enforcement agencies should do whatever they can to ensure they're applying best practices, and that, in the original investigation of a scene when someone dies under suspicious circumstances, or when, someone goes missing, to really make sure that they're doing a thorough investigation and preserving and documenting the evidence, again, in alignment with these best practices that are very readily available out there in the field, and we've cited many of them in our report. So in terms of recommendations, we're suggesting that the cold case review team be expanded and used more widely across Utah, and especially when interested, supporting tribes that may be interested in addressing some of their long-term unsolved cases. for smaller law enforcement agencies, there should be better ways to share investigative resources or to be able to access resources from state and federal agencies and larger local agencies in Utah. So just more sharing of resources for to be able to do these investigations. And as noted again, making sure that in evidence gathering in the first place, evidence storage is done properly from the start. It's done consistently across all cases, so that if a case does turn into a cold case, that there's a lot of improvements in technologies over time. For example, DNA evidence that wasn't testable 10 years ago is testable now and stuff. So keeping really good track of all that type of evidence and gathering it properly in the first place can make a huge difference in solving a case later on. All right, back to Jesse.
Thanks, Nicole. So in terms of death investigation, we learned about how Utah's Office of the Medical Examiner is a crucial source of expertise, who generally investigates all deaths under their jurisdiction thoroughly and in accordance with best practices. And so Utah's centralized medical examiner system is a huge benefit because it ensures a level of standardization and equity in how deaths are investigated across the state. As compared to like in Minnesota, we have a mix of medical examiners and coroners investigating deaths, and there's a lot less consistency in how deaths are investigated and to the extent to which folks follow best practices in our state than yours. So that's a huge benefit. However, the Utah OME's jurisdiction does not extend to any deaths that occurred on non-public law 280 tribal lands in Utah, which are basically all of them except for the Paiute tribe. So for deaths that occur on these tribal lands, the tribal police, BIA, or FBI need to formally request that the Utah OME investigate the death and pay a $2,500 fee for each case. And so we understand from experts that this happens fairly consistently for suspected homicides, but it's unclear whether and how other types of deaths, including like suspected overdoses and suicides, are investigated on tribal lands. We also understand that resource issues, another recurring theme, may impact death investigation in rural Utah, where law enforcement may not have the same experience or expertise as investigators in areas where, unfortunately, homicides are more common, and where agencies may not have the financial resources to invest in investigative technologies like 3D scanners, for example, or regular training for their personnel. And we understand that some law enforcement and medical legal death investigators are communicating really effectively with family members throughout the death investigation process. But we also found that there's some gaps and opportunities to ensure communication is happening more consistently, and that investigators have guidance on how to communicate with families sensitively and in a trauma-informed way. So for example, the Utah OME is in the process of hiring a family advocate who will be charged with proactively reaching out to families in all cases, whereas the current setup is that families can contact the office at any time, but they generally don't proactively reach out to families. So they're exploring opportunities to change their practices in that way, which is really exciting. And then lastly, some key informants discuss the need for law enforcement to receive further training on tribes' cultural and religious practices, particularly pertaining to death. So, for example, tribal practices related to the use of a deceased person's name or photograph. And some key informants noted past incidences when, during a presentation, law enforcement showed a photograph of a deceased person to members of a tribal community, and it caused a lot of distress and upset. And so with further training and education, law enforcement may be able to better navigate those situations in a respectful and compassionate manner. So in terms of recommendations, we would encourage Utah to explore opportunities to build and expand on working relationships between tribal nations and Utah OME. And also provide financial support to some of those more remote or rural or under-resourced law enforcement jurisdictions to help increase access to investigative technology and training. And then providing guidance or support to encourage consistent and proactive communication with families throughout the death investigation process. For example, by hiring more and increasing access to family advocates in law enforcement agencies and the Utah OME office. And then finally, developing training for law enforcement and other death investigators on cultural issues specific to the tribal nations in Utah. Nicole?
Thanks, Jesse. So moving on to jurisdiction issues, government to government collaboration. We've heard clearly from many experts, and just as a reminder, again, we haven't heard as directly from tribal leaders, unfortunately, in this process, although we did try a couple different avenues. It just didn't pan out. But the experts that we heard from within state agencies primarily, it's clear that there's limited law enforcement capacity in many of the tribal communities in Utah, and that the law enforcement situation and response time for community members varies greatly across tribes. So as with all states, there's complex jurisdictional issues that make it harder to do an efficient and comprehensive investigation, especially if the relationships aren't there prior to navigate the jurisdictional stuff when a case does happen. So having prior agreements across jurisdictions, as well as having established relationships across jurisdiction, can really help to support really effective investigations when they do need to happen. It's better to have things worked out ahead of time so that law enforcement leaders and tribal leaders don't have to hash out the details under duress, you know, and amidst this community crisis that's happening when a child or an adult goes missing from their community. So we're recommending that the state of Utah and local law enforcement agencies find a way to improve communication and build trust with tribes and tribal law enforcement. This could be formalized with MOUs or other formal types of collaboration agreements, or it could be more informal, you know, but we really think that documenting it can help to outlast any one individual leader, either on the local or state side or on the tribal side. If you have this MOU in place, then it's kind of, you know, makes it more official. We also recommend that the state of Utah find ways, as the tribes are interested or want this kind of support, to help them better access immediate law enforcement response for community members that right now might need to wait days or hours if something happens and they call for help before law enforcement can get there. So last, we suggest that the state of Utah consider developing some sort of tribal state relations training. We have a training like this in Minnesota that has been extremely well received and helped a lot from my personal point of view of having worked a lot with the state and the tribes over the past 20 years. There's been a significant improvement in the extent to which state agency leaders and staff are prepared to, you know, do tribal consultation, support effective government to government interactions, and working relationships with tribes. So that's something definitely hope you all will consider and would be happy to talk about with you. Back to Jesse for some data issues.
Thanks, Nicole. I feel like we're in an endless tennis match, batting the ball back and forth, but we're getting through a lot of information, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. We'll get there soon. So in terms of data issues, there are some opportunities to improve data completeness and accuracy, and particularly related to the collection of data related to race, ethnicity, and tribal affiliation. So we understand that the Utah Bureau of Criminal Identification does a really thorough job of reviewing and validating all the data they receive. But if it's not collected by law enforcement in the first place, or if it's collected and documented incorrectly, then that creates problems that the BCI can't do anything about. And so we know that Indigenous relatives are frequently misidentified as Hispanic, white, or Asian. So this is a really big missed opportunity and kind of an erasure of that experience that inhibits our ability to track the issue. So we also know that some law enforcement agencies do not participate in all of Utah's data systems, even though some data points are legislatively mandated, with the caveat that those mandates do not apply to tribes as sovereign nations. But the end result is that data from tribal lands is not always represented in state databases unless it's reported to like a local or county law enforcement agency, because the BIA and FBI don't report back to the state of Utah about crimes happening on tribal lands. Key informants also highlighted a lack of shared data systems across jurisdictions in Utah. So, for example, we heard that agencies use 4 or 5 different records management systems, which contributes and hampers cross-agency communication. And in particular, there's a need for more consistent cross-agency notification when someone goes missing from tribal lands and when a tribal member or descendant goes missing off of tribal lands. So ensuring that all the relevant jurisdictions are in the loop and understand what's happening so they can contribute to the investigation and location of that person. So we understand that the NCIC is an important, crucial shared data source that helps support communication across agencies about missing persons. Some key informants did express concerns that that happens inconsistently across jurisdictions. So we would encourage Utah to implement training or legislative changes to ensure timely and consistent reporting of missing persons to NCIC, as well as developing and implementing training for law enforcement on gathering accurate and complete information on race, ethnicity, and tribal affiliation. Exploring opportunities to increase cross-agency notification when a person goes missing, and then generally looking at ways of increasing data sharing and communication across jurisdictions through things like law enforcement agreements. So I'll pass it back to Nicole to talk about victim and family services.
We're getting close to the end here. We just have a couple more topics to cover, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion. So we found that there are some gaps in Utah when it comes to communication with victims and families, in particular about the status of a law enforcement investigation, prosecution, or a medical examiner findings. So it can be particularly challenging for law enforcement and maybe some of these other professionals to navigate balancing families' expectations with wanting a lot of information and wanting to know what's happening with the need to protect the integrity of the case and not divulge information that could compromise that. This contributes to distrust and additional pain and re-traumatization for families who are kind of already going through a traumatic experience, and then they feel like a lot of times maybe that their case isn't being given any attention because they can't get any information. Sometimes that might be true, and sometimes it might not be true. So sometimes there might be a lot of stuff going on with the investigation, but the investigator feels for whatever reason they can't share that. And so there's just a need for additional training for people who work in a range of systems: law enforcement, hospitals, prosecutors, victim services, medical examiners, to be more victim-centered and trauma-informed in their approaches to communication, and knowing that maintaining regular communication really is important, even if you don't have any actual new information to provide. Just that communication is really key for a lot of families. Victims and families frequently encounter and work with multiple victim service providers and advocates throughout an investigation and prosecution process. And we found that there's a need for more coordination and communication across these victim service providers and advocates so that it's a little bit more of a streamlined and clear process for the families, or maybe even that there would be fewer people that they would need to interact with. One specific recommendation is that for focus for policymakers in particular is that your crime victims reparation fund requires cooperation with law enforcement, except for limited cases of strangulation and sexual assault. And this can be a barrier for some victims who are just distrusting police or who don't want to get law enforcement involved. And it results in a lot of MMIR cases not being eligible for this particular reparations fund. And additionally, family members of long-term missing persons, even those with suspected criminal involvement, aren't eligible for support, given that, again, being missing isn't considered a crime. So we've found in our research that flexible financial supports better help victims meet their needs and are generally more cost effective than some predetermined services and supports that are more restrictive, and both to the organization providing it and to the person receiving the service. Two specific areas that need a bit more attention in Utah is availability of mental health supports and also comprehensive resources for victims of trafficking, such as like the safe harbor laws that we have in Minnesota. So we recommend increasing access to victim service providers and related professional victim and family services providers. And we recommend that these providers coordinate amongst themselves to provide a more streamlined experience for victims and family members. In general, communication could be improved with victims and family members in the investigation process. And this is a theme that cuts across all the topic areas we've talked about today. We noted some more training is needed for professionals about being trauma informed, again, kind of cutting across a few different topic areas. Also making changes to systems like intake forms and processes to align with best practices from the research that's been done about trauma informed and victim centered services. And lastly, we recommend identifying barriers to accessing reparation funding and addressing those barriers either legislatively or with agency policies and practices.
So in terms of prevention, we heard how key informants emphasized how economic and social vulnerabilities, so things like unemployment, poverty, mental health concerns, substance use issues, and particularly homelessness, can increase risk of crime victimization, manipulation, and exploitation. So one quote that really stood out to me is someone in our interview said, if we just raised people's standard of living, we would have a lot fewer MMIR cases, or something to that effect. We also learned about the need to re-examine the duration and enforcement of protective orders. So specifically, it seems like there, in some cases, is a gap in protection created by the expiration of jail release agreements and when the person actually has their first court date, due to lack of capacity and delays in getting those court dates scheduled. And additionally, the need for the development and implementation of a validated domestic violence risk assessment protocol for folks who may be screened perfectly fine on generalized risk assessment protocols when they're considered for things like pretrial release or bail, but those things don't necessarily cover their risk of inflicting violence on a domestic partner. Key informants also emphasize the need for community education and awareness on forms of interpersonal violence and exploitation, as well as the general MMIR issue. And we also heard from experts and community members about the importance of cultural identity and community connection and how they can be a source of protection and healing. And so folks both spoke to how when people are disconnected from their community of origin and their cultural identity, that can increase their risk of victimization, but conversely, how it can be a source of protection, and how for families who have undergone violence, how their culture has been a huge source of healing for them throughout the grieving and healing process. So in terms of recommendations, expanding community education and public awareness efforts, creating and providing comprehensive supports for victims of trafficking, improving identification and intervention among those at high risk of continued violence and victimization, so we can prevent them from becoming an MMIR case, from going missing and being murdered. Identifying and addressing gaps in data sharing regarding protective orders, and identifying other barriers like the duration of protection in jail release agreements, as well as providing financial support for tribal cultural revitalization and violence prevention programming.
This is our last topic area, and this concerns the media, and specifically that the media might not be as responsive to MMIR cases compared with other cases. And perhaps, and also in other situations, the media may perpetuate stereotypes by how they portray MMIR victims. And in our review of the literature and talking with experts on this issue, we found that using survivor-centered approach of framing MMIR related stories is strongly recommended. This includes making sure to humanize the victim in the narrative, avoid sharing irrelevant, negative information about the victim or unnecessary graphic details about their case or their victimization. Another key best practice for the media is to include information about the victim's tribal affiliation, especially in cases of emergent missing persons where a person may be traveling back and forth between their reservation in Salt Lake City or other urban areas. Also, when reporting on any individual case, the journalist should take care to just place it within the context of the larger MMIR injustice. So in order to do these things, members of the media may need additional training, personal exploration of how they intend to address this topic. As noted, hopefully using a survivor-centered approach. Media can also help to shed light on the MMIR injustice, which has definitely started to happen with some media spaces over the past few years. And I would just also note for you all that the public release of this MMIR task force report would be a great opportunity for you all to rally some of your local media to help draw more attention to this issue around Utah. So just to kind of, before we jump into the questions and discussions, share with you what's happening next. We knew that today we wouldn't necessarily have time to really dig in to all the topics as much as folks might want. So we made these sessions available, and Charlie has a sign-up sheet for task force members because we're trying to balance how many task force members are able to attend each session, and we'll cover these topics in more detail and really just have a pretty open discussion time over a little bit more extended period of time. So if you do have thoughts or things that you want to talk about that we don't get into today, hopefully you'll be able to attend one of these sessions. Please communicate with Charlie if you have any concerns or questions about that. And then, as we mentioned, we're going to be making revisions on the report. We're getting some feedback, not a lot, but we've gotten some from the experts that we interviewed, who we invited to review the report. I assume we'll get some from you all today and after today. And then the finalized report will be completed by November and presented to you all in person at your task force meeting in November. So after that, I'm not sure, we're not on contract anymore, but we would recommend that your task force really develop some kind of an action plan based on this report, or somehow assigning, prioritizing and assigning which recommendations are we going to pursue immediately and who's kind of responsible for that. In Minnesota, they created an MMIR office. Not sure if you all are thinking about that or anything else like that. Otherwise, maybe there's different folks on the task force and other state agency folks that can pick up some of these, but that's what we've got for you today. I know that was a lot of information, but we were trying to balance of like making sure that we showed you everything that was there, as much as we could of what was there, and then providing some time to talk about this. So happy to first, if there's any clarifying questions or any general feedback, like, was this what you thought we were going to do, or was this what you expect? Is there anything we missed or got wrong? Any recommendations that you want to discuss specifically? There might be some that you want to add that we don't have in here, or something that you saw that you'd like to change or remove. So yeah, we'd like to hear your feedback, and I'll stop sharing so that we can open it up for discussion.
Okay, thank you. It's a great presentation, and I know a lot of research went into it, and was curious to see what other states are doing. And like I said, New Mexico, I wasn't sure if they were making any headway or not. I hadn't heard much. I know that North and South Dakotas where there was a lot of issues. Were you able to contact anyone in those states? North or South Dakota or Montana to see what they're doing? Did you mention New Mexico?
Yeah, we had, so I just heard from one of our consultants on this project that there was something happening in Montana related to MMIR, and he pointed it out because he thought it was interesting that they had a whole day devoted to children who go missing from out of home placement, which we know is a big issue in Minnesota and Utah as well. Jesse, do you recall the other states that were at the New Mexico convening? I think it was California and Nebraska, and who else?
I think that's everyone who ended up turning up. There's a couple others who didn't end up making it, but
Okay, thank you. Come to our task force members. Any questions for our researchers? Chairman?
I'd like to turn it over to any other task force members that are present or online, and I might have a couple of questions after.
Okay.
I didn't know if Yolanda had any questions, and I wanted to give her the time to be able to ask them.
Sure. Thank you, Nicole and Jesse, for putting this report together with your team from the Wilder Research. It has been a great read. In reading through the report, I am still going through some of the edits, and in addition, there was one thing that I wanted the task force to be familiar with that I learned while at the Women Are Sacred conference held in Albuquerque, New Mexico last month. There was a presentation that came forward that talked about that there was a correlation between children in foster care and MMIR. And what I asked my staff to look for the literature and the study on this that happened based on it came from the Yurok tribe, both a professor and an attorney who took a deep dive into what is happening when children are running away from a foster home, and when they're captured, they're returned back to the home. I'm overgeneralizing this, but brought back to the foster home and will have new shoes, new clothes, hair done, etc. And often are finding that the children who are running away are being sex trafficked and then captured and returned back to the foster home. So hoping to get more information on that as my staff is looking for it, and including some of that, because I don't think that we've spent any time. There's nothing in the report currently necessarily that expands on this particular topic. We are also in contact with the Utah foster care to also find out more information from Stephanie Benali, who is the representative that serves tribes, especially, and is involved when children are fostered to other Native American families. The other thing, now I realize that this current report doesn't allude or expand on any of that part of what we've discussed, but I think it's important to do a little bit more review of what's happening in Utah and children who are in foster care, particularly Native American children. And so I think that while Restoring Ancestral Links is going to be participating in these future recommendations that Charlie has put together with those dates, I'm hoping that by one of those dates we'll have more information, and I'd like for Wilder to consider putting that information in. The other thing that I really saw mostly written into the report, well, this report is going to be going to the public. When we did these listening sessions, I'm thinking in particular about the one we held in Bluff, Utah, as an organization where we had a number of tribal members come forward speaking directly about the missing and murdered in their community. the thing in language in the report that kind of, it mentions law enforcement throughout, right? But it isn't clarifying what law enforcement that is. And I think it's important because we have several different law enforcement entities. We have tribal, we have Bureau of Indian Affairs, we have the state of Utah Highway Patrol, we have the San Juan County Sheriff's Office, we have Salt Lake City Police Department, we have all these different entities. The reason that that's important is because when you're talking about multi-jurisdictional issues, some of those are because there are a number of different agents, law enforcement agencies that are involved. And some don't want to get involved because they will bring up that there's a kind of this misunderstanding or lack of understanding what tribal sovereignty means. And so I think that if you can, and we've started going through it, my staff and I, and have asked the question, which law enforcement I think that needs to be clarified, because it for a number of reasons. It also relates to, again, that multi-jurisdictional issues that we're coming up against are would be helpful when we're reading this. Honestly, in looking at the presentation today with the recommendations that are being considered, something that I see very quickly in terms of those recommendations is the need for there to be one office or one person within state government who is gathering information and being the conduit between the state agencies and the tribes. And right now, while there may be a non-tribal liaison within a department, it's really critical that this person have direct relationships with law enforcement and communication with tribal law enforcement, BIA law enforcement, among all the tribes that are here. And also report back to the Division of Indian Affairs when they have their tribal leaders meeting every quarter, that this person is offering a report on what does the missing and murdered Indigenous population look like. Not only, well, for especially the state of Utah. That's really what's jumping out at me. It's not written in the recommendations, but I will share at this point, from everything that I've read in the experiences and listening sessions and literature and media reports that have been out to this point from Indigenous populations across the country, that restoring ancestral winds will be, I don't want it to be a surprise like you were saying earlier, restoring ancestral winds is going to make this recommendation that it be included in this report. And to some folks in state government, that will not be a surprise because I've had a number of conversations with folks. But I think that there needs to be a person identified that is going to be, or a person, an office that is going to be taking in this information and conducting some of this work and making sure that agencies who are named in this report are actually doing the work, so that it isn't sitting there for decades to come.
While you're on that subject, they mentioned that BIA, FBI does not report to the Utah database, and that would be helpful, I think, if we could just have them know who to send, how to get it to them.
Absolutely, I agree.
And I guess I wanted to kind of talk based off of, and I know you probably still have a few more, but based off of these recommendations, based off of what the Wilder Institute has found, and asking them a question based off these recommendations. There's a lot of stuff in here, and I'm wondering if, I know we want to, our colleagues don't like to have task force, but this is a really, really important issue, and I just don't know if we as a task force are done with what we got from here, where I feel like we maybe need to expand a couple more years so that we can explore. Because now we have these recommendations, so like how this is kind of a guide for our staff here that we can work on and really deep dive in some of these issues as a task force over the next couple of years. So that I was like, oh yeah, the task force is done, but after going through this and having a friend of mine go through this, they're like, your work's not done. And I'm like, you're right. And so I'm wondering if that's a particular piece, because I think we make these recommendations, and I see this all the time when we have task force or other committees. We make the recommendation, and I even sit on the ledge audit committee, and there's recommendations made, nothing ever happens. And so I feel strongly that expanding the task force in a couple more years is needed. And I feel like we have a guide now to help us really dissect some of these issues that are pointed out, and also to work more closely with our tribal communities, because I know there was a lack of participation, and I know that a lot of that had to do with just how many of our tribal leaders, many of them maybe felt what happened this past legislative session. I can't say that. I've had a couple of conversations with people. And so I think we need to make sure that we are, as a task force, also working a little bit more with our tribal leaders, as well as people within, an urban setting like us. But really deep diving into those questions and holding task force member a little bit more accountable. We have a lot of task force members that represent agencies and organizations within the state, but yeah, I don't see it, all of us here. And so what do we need to do to make it a little bit more a priority? So this is priority for me. So I didn't know what Senator Deacons was thinking, but I'd like to possibly extend the task force, and I will talk to the leadership team on my side of the aisle and showing them this report and telling them these are things we have to deep dive into. And I just don't think we could do that through the Native American Legislative Liaison Committee. I think we really need to focus on MMIR in order to address some of these issues, and I just don't feel like our work is done yet. But I don't know whether it's.
And I'll piggyback onto that. One of the things that was mentioned was lack of training. I think in my area, it's more lack of manpower than it is training. I think our people are well trained. It's just that there's not enough people to do all the tasks that they have to do, like in rural Utah, like San Juan County, Grand County. You know what I mean? In other words, these guys are pretty well trained, and I think they know. Because I mean, I don't think that they treat. Say, I noticed that a white person that gets more attention than a Native American. I don't believe that for a minute, to be honest with you. I think that these guys, because I know a lot of the deputies and stuff, and a lot of them are Native Americans, and I just think that there's just not enough manpower in a lot of cases in my area to do all this investigation. I mean, you got to, in Moab, for instance, 2.5 million tourists coming through there. These guys are, that don't know the area. They drive them, whatever, fast and whatnot. These guys are patrolling the roads and everything else, and they got a lot of things on their plate to digest and take care of. One of the things that I was unaware of in the Cedar City meeting that we had down there, one of the ladies testified that 80% of the victims usually know they're the perpetrator in a lot of cases. And so there, I follow that back to a lot, like she mentioned, mental health. And they've known a lot of these people that have, gone off the deep end or whatever because of drugs or whatever it may be. And so I think there's an issue there that our work isn't done by any means as a task force, in my opinion. I think that we need to follow up with some of this, make sure that this, and we really do need to work with, I even like to say city police and county police.
And I just had a conversation with Chief Brown, so I was running late, and I'm like, hello, I'd love for you to sit down and meet with our research team. And he told me yes. So we'll be talking offline.
Because it's going to help everyone, whether they're, no matter what nationality or anything that has to do with it, whether they're people coming in from Mexico or whatever that don't know the system at all, and being human trafficked and don't know where to go to or who to even get help from. And so public awareness, I think, is probably one of our biggest
trafficking
tests.
Is huge, and I think we see movies and different things, but you know, as someone, as a legislator who's been working on trafficking and working with Yolanda and other organizations for years on just to address trafficking, it's huge. So I agree. There's so much stuff in here, and as I mentioned to Chief Brown, this is not a gotcha thing for anyone. This is about finding the gaps in the system so that we can make things better and we can make things whole. And I don't think any of us are trying to do a gotcha on anyone. We're just trying to identify the gaps, and we've identified some of that, but we still are missing voices like this and tribal leaders. And I feel like that's another step that we need to take. And that be something we talked to the Wilder Institute about, if there's a way to extend, if we're able to get more appropriation funding, some different things. But there's a huge roadmap here that I think our staff work with us on. And I really feel like we have a lot more work to do, and I don't want to just drop it. I just don't feel comfortable with that.
I'll just highlight one of the things that happens that I've been talking to in San Juan County, for instance, is that it's more or less a catch and release, because they have nowhere to take them, because they used to take them to Shiprock, but because that facility is pretty well dilapidated.
It's Canton now,
Kayenta now.
Arizona,
Okay. But, so that ain't as bad as I thought it was.
which is a lot further.
It's further, of course, but
It's a lot further than
Monticello is
Shiprock.
not close either, you know, but,
No.
so we need something, we need to do something like in Monument Valley or in, Montezuma Creek or somewhere that we can have a holding facility, and to have a place where the county sheriffs can have some interaction with the BIA or the FBI or whoever it might be that's policing the rest of the territory, reservation territory.
So I know we're kind of jumping around all over the place, and I think this is a healthy conversation. It's good. I just wanted to see if Taylor or Ozzy had anything to add to this.
Oh, we have Ms. Beckett. Would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, I apologize. I don't actually have a video. I tried to do it earlier and it was just blurry. So I believe there was a request for me to turn my video on, but I don't have video for you all. So I wanted to jump into the part of the conversation that we got to that involved an issue of how law enforcement is really handling the sensitive nature and culturally impacting some of these investigations. I prosecute cases. I prosecute cases from Cache County down to Iron County, Washington County. I'm all across the state. And my sole focus from the Attorney General's office is the issue of human trafficking. So I work specifically with these vulnerable populations. And I can speak from firsthand experience in that regard, that there is a lot of cultural misunderstanding, that there is a significant amount of limited resources, and the way that those resources tend to be allocated. We do get folks who are high risk in the work that I do, whether that's because they're homeless, because they're minorities, because they have mental health or substance use issues. And that does unfortunately play a role in how the case is handled by law enforcement. I don't think it is an intentional thing most of the time. I think we are actually getting a lot better at addressing those issues and putting aside that bias that some of us just inherently come with based on our own experiences. But I will say that there, even in bigger cities and smaller rural communities, I do still deal with the issue of like, oh, well, you know, this person, they were engaged in, you know, substance use, so they can't be a victim of trafficking, or they have, you know, this cultural background, so that's just kind of how they've done things. So it does come up. I don't think it's an inherent or an intentional thing. And I think that there is a general tendency of law enforcement to want to help, but we do tend to allocate those resources in a way that I think is impacted by that bias. And I think not adding that voice to what we're talking about would do us a disservice to what we're trying to do. I have also had scenarios where I discuss labor trafficking issues with even the BIA and some rural communities, and there's an inherent misunderstanding about what constitutes that and how somebody's vulnerabilities can lead them to becoming a victim. and a lot of those have a cultural implication. So I think we do need to acknowledge that sometimes there are those shortcomings, whether they're intentional or not. I don't think really gets at the issue. I think we just need to acknowledge that there are those, and how we can better train and work around those. And I think people generally want to do a better job in terms of those investigations, but I do on a regular basis see those. So I just wanted to add that to the discussion that we were having, because I think it's important in terms of what we're trying to do with this research moving forward and making those recommendations. I'm not sure if you guys heard me very well because I spoke quite a bit there, so I apologize.
No problem. Ozzy, would you like to weigh in? We can't hear you. You're muted. Still no. He's not muted there.
It's not really there. I think it's a connection.
Maybe while he's trying to figure that out.
Yeah, go ahead, Mr.
So I certainly appreciate the report. I know we had a lot of conversations. I did, at least with Jesse on this. I appreciate that. I know BCI is looking at some of those, addressing the Amber Alert. We're going to look at that and provide some clarity with that a little bit. And then certainly, we talked a little bit about agreements between agencies. And those MOUs is the term that we use, memorandums of understanding. And certainly good quality MOUs between agencies and different organizations is super, super helpful. And I think moving forward, for us, for law enforcement, what do those look like with tribes, with tribal entities, with BIA, Navajo PD, with the FBI? Certainly, there's probably some room for improvement there, and I think we could look closer at that. And then model policies, model expectations when it comes to these types of investigations. What does that look like? And how does the state kind of share that out, what the expectations are? I think there's probably some clarity to push out from the state out to all the different entities. So certainly a lot of things here we could look at and improve. And then one other thing, victim advocates are key. Victim advocates, I don't know how any law enforcement agency or prosecutor, I don't know how you function without a victim advocate. I just don't know how, those that don't have them, how they functioning in the world we live in today. And so victim advocates, do we have enough of them? The answer is no, we don't. And so part of that is keeping the communication up with victims and victims' families, survivors. Communication is always key with that, and victim advocates play a huge role with that. And so those are my just initial takeaways, and we're certainly taking a deeper dive into this and provide some more clarity down the road. But it's a great report, great information, and there's things to work on.
And that's why I'm really feeling like, and then I'll turn over to Ozzy, hopefully his sounds working, but that's why I feel like we can have more in-depth conversations based off of this in our task force meetings. And so I'd love to extend this out for at least another 2 years.
Okay. Also, you want to try that again?
Sure, can you hear me now?
There we go. Yes, sir.
Oh, sorry about that. I apologize.
No problem.
It's good to be here. Thank you for that report. I wanted to say that I agree with what Ms. Romero said about involving the tribal leaders. I think that is important, engaging each tribal government of the state of Utah. And then also I wanted to say that MOUs and cross-deputization agreements are important. And I know we had a meeting with Dustin Jensen a little while ago between Tooele Sheriff's Department, the Goshute tribe, in which the sheriff expressed hesitancy about responding to any incidents on the reservation, and after the tribal government was willing to enter an agreement with them. So I think those are real things that we need to clarify, working on those agreements so everybody knows what the role is. The other interesting thing that the sheriff mentioned is that sheriffs usually serve between 2 to 4 years terms, and when they leave the office, that agreement becomes null or void. So it must be renegotiated. So I think a lot of times, or in some cases, the agreements have lasted as long as that sheriff has been in office, and then once they leave, then it sort of goes to limbo. So I think that's something to look into. And then the other one is, as far as like the Amber Alerts, figuring out how to do a data sharing agreement between the state and the tribes. We've spoken as a department with tribes, and they are more than willing to enter into these agreements as long as everybody goes to the table to discuss. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Have anybody else online? Anyone from the task force would like to add any more?
No, I just think it's great to hear from task force members, just because through the Attorney General's office, through DPS, through DHS, there's so many things that are moving parts, and maybe us working with our staff here, just working with all of you, just to kind of get updates so that we're continuously updating task force members and maybe community members, so people can kind of see the momentum and what we're doing with the task force, so that they know that we're actually doing things. Because I think a lot of times it's about communication, and there's a lot of communication gaps and holes. And so I just want people to know, like, we've put a lot of work into this, and people have done that within their individual departments or divisions within the state, and also working with other entities. And so I think there's ways in which we can work a little bit better with the executive branch and the work that they're doing to address some of the concerns raised here as well.
And, you know, although we haven't had a lot of task force meetings, we do talk about these issues with our Native American committee. And so, you know, it's been kind of the center of most of our topics there. But I would like to open this up to the public. Would anyone from the public wish to weigh in on the way we could be doing this better, or any issues that they may have?
I'd like to hear a little bit more about the troubles that.
Would you like to come forward?
Sure.
Up here where we can hear. I'm an old deaf man, kind of.
Let's just tell us your name.
Tell your name and identify yourself and who you're with.
Hello, my name is Ruby Johnston. I'm the helpline coordinator at Restoring Ancestral Lands. I was in attendance at the listening session down in Bluff. So I met the folks from Wilder. Just thinking about this, I would like to address the issues with getting in touch with tribal leadership that Wilder encountered. I know that these things personally, for myself, they've been very difficult, but I think that those things need to be addressed. If the ways in which y'all were trying to get in contact with tribal leadership weren't working,
Hey,
then
before you go any farther, is that the 7 chapters, or are you talking about the Navajo Nation? Because the 7 chapters have been very good that I've dealt with as far as Red Mesa or.
I was just referring to what they refer to in their report. They said that they
So
were
they've been trying to get probably the Navajo Nation, because our local chapters in San Juan County are very.
Yeah, and maybe that's where we need you to step in, Senator Hinkins, is making sure that following through with our.
Yeah,
what we're
I just
trying-
want to make sure that people, you know, that we're.
For sure,
Okay.
right.
And also, there's been a transition of a new president. So we've, you know, at least the Navajo's gone through new leadership changes, so we need to let them. Yes, and that's why it's probably good that we extend this to get them up to speed on it, because I mean they want to do it. I mean, it's just that they're, because I think the first lady was on our task force for a while, wasn't she?
She
was an advisor.
She presented with me, she just testified with me at our committee and said she wanted to be more involved. And so there's a way to get her more involved. I'm more than happy to have her.
President
have
Ness
her
is
do
his
that.
wife. That was.
And she served in
Didn't mean to
the
interrupt.
Arizona legislature and those friends of ours. So
Yeah, continue. I just wanted to make sure that we wasn't throwing our chapter presidents under the bus on this one.
Not at all.
Okay.
So the reference in the report is all of the tribal leaders, typically the chairman, or the president, or the chairperson of each federally recognized tribe in the state of Utah is who they are intending to speak to.
Okay. That being said, if the ways in which you're reaching out to them aren't working, then I think that should be addressed and changed. If it's not working, then there needs to be a different route to take. It shouldn't just be an end all be all for that.
And to the credit of the chapter, the nation presidents, you know, if somebody just calls from Wilder and say, I'm with them and I want to know a bunch of questions and stuff like that, they're probably saying, I got things to do. You know, maybe we should have maybe reached out as,
That's, and I think, like, we take kindly to your recommendation. I think we were utilizing some resources through, I think there's some different steps we can take as the chairs of the committee and maybe members of the committee to help us connect with, some of those.
and we can do that through our Native Liaison Committee, I think, do that as well, so.
I think that would be
Continue though,
better.
I think that's a good point though.
As the recommendation suggested, they wanted the state to follow up with the tribes through formal consultation, and I just think all the things that tribal nations have been through, having some organization knock on their door and call, say, hey, we're from Wilder, we're conducting this test. No one's gonna want to interact with that, and then on top of that, having the state of Utah follow up to knock on your door and say, hey, we want to test you on this. No one's interested in that as well. So I think if it comes from a different lens that is much more native oriented and much more from a place of holistic care and healing, that is something that folks are actually going to be interested in interacting with.
Thank you.
Thanks for your testimony. Anyone else would like to?
Would you like to add anything else?
Yeah, go ahead.
I would, I'm a little curious about the National Crime Information Center and just the sharing of data and how we can actually get any or all of that information a little bit more umbrellaed and dispersed better for tribes and also for coalitions and anybody who's interested in accessing that data. I think that it's really siloed and really difficult to get any access to that data. And I understand that the BIA and the FBI and all of these different jurisdictions don't talk to each other, which makes things really complicated. And I know that there is no really easy way to just kind of erase the way everything was made and set up. But if there is a way to get that information just more generalized for people to access, that's something that would be extremely helpful for service providers and for tribal members as well as missing and broken Indigenous relatives.
For your testimony. Anyone else online with nobody? We'll come back to the test. Mr. Toledo, would you like to weigh in? James, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, sir. Yeah, go ahead.
I don't have the ability to share my camera, but I guess I'll just go ahead and speak. I mean, first, I just want to,
Yeah, recognize, tell people who you are, so.
first, I just like to thank the consultants for putting this report together. I thought it had some great recommendations to begin with, and so it just wanted to kind of chime in regards to tribal leader participation. Again, I think this report I think would be beneficial to report out to tribal leaders. We do have a tribal leader meeting coming up on October 13th. The Navajo Nation is hosting this meeting. We're currently trying to identify the meeting location, but it will be somewhere in San Juan County. And I think having a report that was shared today, shared with tribal leadership at this meeting, I think would be beneficial. And hopefully that gets the ball rolling for further engagement with tribal leadership as to, the recommendations that were identified and suggested. And as we move forward in this process, I think that could be a great opportunity for that level of engagement. And again, just keeping tribes updated and included in the conversation as best as we can. We do have to also recognize that leadership is pressed with time. They have other, many responsibilities that are on their plate. And so I think the UTL meeting could be a good opportunity to provide a good overview, like what was presented today, and then kind of maybe have some dialogue and discussion as to identifying next steps. So
James, could we get put on the agenda? This is Representative Romero, by chance, to present the findings of the draft findings of the report.
Yes, absolutely. We would be happy to add this onto the agenda.
Okay, perfect. Well, we'll have you coordinate with Charlie and then she can kind of keep us as task force members and Wilder Institute informed.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Any other business from our task force?
Yeah, I just wanted to share, this is Yolanda, Nicole and Jesse, is there a section in here, maybe I'm missing it, on definitions? Because there's some definitions that we didn't quite see when we were looking at this. In particular, you know, for instance, we talk about PL 280, but I don't see a broad definition of PL 280. I think also important is identifying what an NGO is, and also there's some other language that is used in here that some of our populations may not quite understand. Often people are not understanding the difference between race and ethnicity, and I think defining those would be important too.
Oh, you lost.
As well
Lost me
as
with that one.
as well as folks are often making reference to Native American tribes or just tribes. They're using that word tribe or tribal in many different contexts that has nothing to do with Native American people, or and so having a definition on that would be important. But if we could maybe have a definition page, I know there are more words that we saw, but those for now are what are coming to mind. So if we could include that into the report, I think that would be helpful. What is medical legal? Medical legal death? I didn't know
That's
what that
the death investigation conducted by the Office of the Medical Examiner.
Oh, okay. We're still looking through the rest of this. One thing I really liked that was the inclusion of reference to the Ashland Mike Amber Alert in Indian Country. I think that also has some better potential for our tribes in the state of Utah. I mean, do you all know the story about Ashland and Ian Mike? What happened in Shiprock? These are two small Navajo children that were kidnapped and taken to a very remote area in New Mexico, and the person who took them solicited them as they got off the school bus and were playing in like a gully area, and he lured them into his van, the perpetrator did, and by asking them if they wanted to watch a movie. And Ashland had injured her foot, and so she went into the van, but her brother was trying to get her to not go in the van, but he didn't want her to go by herself. Ashland was the older sister. They ended up both getting in the van. He took them to this remote location where he parked the van and asked Ian to stay in the van while he took Ashland further out and sexually assaulted her and killed her. And Ian, while he was waiting, got out of the van and ran down a very remote road, and was found by a couple of Navajo elderly people who then took him straight to the police department in Shiprock. And so as a result of that, Ashland Mike's mom has played a really instrumental role in getting this Amber Alert across tribes in the United States to formulate a better system. Something that was mentioned in the report that I thought was really important as well is that, you know, when we dial 911 here in Ogden, Utah, or any other place outside of a tribal nation. We can expect that law enforcement, fire, police will be there in a matter of minutes. But when folks are driving down in the remote areas, much like we do, our staff does, in working with tribes, we're lucky if there is cell phone reception. We're lucky if there is even a Wi-Fi connection. We take our chances every time we do that, and I take my chances driving alone in the deserts through San Juan County when I am visiting with our tribes down in southern Utah. I think that reference to infrastructure in terms of, you know, you can drive between Blanding and White Mesa, and you can even physically see the infrastructure change the minute it goes into the tribal nation boundary. I mean, the road looks really good, and then all of a sudden you get to the boundary where White Mesa is, and the roads are poor all the way through until you get outside of back onto a state-owned highway. And I think that when I'm talking about Wi-Fi, cell phone, that infrastructure needs to be improved, because our tribes are currently, most of our tribes located in the state of Utah are operating at a deficit when it comes to the safety of the people. So thank you for including that.
There is an update on fiber optics though now on 191, so it will improve because, you know, there wasn't any to Bluff was closest to
I'm gonna hold you to that. Did you hear that?
It's already there. It's already to Navajo Mountain. Well, it's on its way to Navajo Mountain, but it's already to Monument Valley.
What about through Aneth? Aneth is poor.
Well, as far as cell phone
Or
reception,
through-
I'm
yeah,
not
cell
sure
phone
about
reception.
that, but Emory County's just as bad. So.
Yeah, DOJ was calling me and I had no idea.
But I'm trying to think, is there one of those Amber Alert signs anywhere south of the Helper? Helper's the last one.
South of Helper, I can't think of any. No, we drive that.
That's the
we
last
drive
one I
that
can think of.
often.
There's one in Spanish Fork, because you hit top of Spanish Fork.
Yeah,
Canyon and the
Spanish
one in-
Fork has
And
their.
that's when I've
Wait.
noticed that sometimes the road's closed to Price, so you can detour through Huntington Canyon. But
Yeah,
yeah, I think the last one's Helper right now, so. Okay. Seeing no other business today.
I could talk about this the rest of the day, but. my
Like I said,
phone
since
was
there's no
running
other. We appreciate it and thank you for your input, because, you know, a lot of us don't know, you know, you're down, you live, you know, you walk the walk down there and talk the talk, and that's what we need to, that's why we have this task force to have input, so we know what's going on.
Yeah,
So we can't
legislators.
help it. We don't know.
We as legislators can only do so much, and that's why when we formed the task force, we wanted to make sure there was proper Indigenous representation and also state representation, people that are actually somewhat on the ground, some some not, but being able to, you know, sometimes stuff can happen through an admin role. Sometimes it doesn't have to be legislated, so we just wanted to make sure we're getting a clear picture and we know like this is beginning steps, it's not the end, and so we definitely need to expand the task force.
I do have a question for you, Representative, related to when a task force is in place versus a commission versus an office. What is the distinction between task force work continuing for 2 years or a commission being created to continue the work beyond 5 years?
It's complicated and our colleagues don't.
That's why we have drafting attorneys.
And even with the task force, we can
task force.
put it out for longer than every 2 years, but in order to justify that, we have to talk about, I mean, we have to present on the board, don't be an issue based off of this, about why we feel like it has to be extended and why we have to focus more time on it. So it's a matter of, us working with our staff and figuring that out.
480 commissions and committees and stuff, and they are all, every year they're trying to get rid of some of them, so we changed the names. Oh, yeah. well, it's just-
They're always trying
A
to.
lot of them aren't utilized. So.
Or a lot of people don't get their task force or their commissions, they don't get out of the house, off the house floor. The houses where they kill those kind of bills. So, for us to have a bipartisan support for this, and I don't really see people resistant to the work myself and Senator Hinkins are doing with all of you. I don't really see many major challenges, so we'll talk with staff, but I think we thought we still need more time. I guess that's.
If you put it, I think it seems helpful to, right at the top of the report, it notes that the population, our tribal communities are very small. They're less than 2%. So when we are, while changes need to happen within state entities, there needs to be also that support to tribes, because right now, like I said earlier, we're operating at a deficit. But if we can somehow mandate the action of those who are operating in state agencies to, I have full faith that state agencies mean well, that they do want to work with tribes. I have had that experience, but then when we go and are meeting with community members, maybe not leadership, but community members, we're hearing where those gaps exist, and some of them have been stated in the report. But what I'm saying is that if we can have the help of the legislature to mandate some of those responsibilities with tribes, that would really, really help, because then it would be a mandate, be set in law. So try to think about that.
Those are things I think we consider as we move forward. This was a lot of information, and I want people to, if they still have time to go over it again, if they still have recommendations, to let the Wilder Institute know or staff know. And we're working towards Wilder coming out in November and presenting to the law enforcement committee and maybe executive offices and criminal justice, the appropriation. Although it's appropriation, I think there could be reasons to do that, to talk about the lack of funding and why it's important to fund some of the recommendations. And so maybe we can work with some of our fiscal analysts on that, kind of write up some stuff.
One other thing related to training that I do want to share while DPS is here is that the Navajo Nation Police Chief has been so open to engaging with San Juan County and state of Utah about having that cross commission be used all across Navajo within the state of Utah. And the other thing that they're open to is that in terms of training, they would definitely like to send their officers to training on. There are specific kinds of training that they're interested in, particularly around the LAP. And that would be, I know that they've expressed interest on that, but also he's the director of CI on the Navajo Nation, is also interested in if there's any potential to have training that involves officers from both entities at a location on Utah Navajo. He would be open to that, to creating a facility that allows that to happen. So
Super helpful. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Well, in conclusion, just like to thank the Weber State for the hospitality. This is a nice facility. It's a beautiful campus. I got to see half of it trying to find this meeting. It's a very nice campus. But I appreciate them allowing us to have this here, and we've been able to have it in Bluff. We've been able to have it in Cedar City, and so it's nice to be able to see the different areas of the state. So appreciate all those that attended and all those that are online, and thank you for your participation. And I would entertain a motion to conclude.
Motion to adjourn.
Adjourn. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. We are concluded. Thank you. So do you guys kind of help like